to my dearest friend living in the world next to mine. I hope this message finds you well, though I suspect your world might be quite different from ours. You see, I'm writing to you from a place where something extraordinary happened. Something that changed everything we thought we knew about the nature of reality itself. Let me start with a question that might sound absurd to you. In your world, when you imagine something, really vividly imagine it, does it ever become real? Because here, it does. And that, my dear friend, is both our greatest miracle and our most devastating curse. It all began on what we now call the first manifestation day, though nobody called it that at the time. It was just Tuesday, March 15th, 23 years ago. A perfectly ordinary spring morning until nothing was ordinary ever again. Picture this, and please do be careful with your picturing, for reasons you'll soon understand. A 7-year-old girl named Emma Thompson, sitting in her primary school classroom in Manchester. She was daydreaming during maths lessons, as children do, imagining that her pencil case was actually a tiny dragon that could breathe rainbow-colored fire. At precisely 10:47 a.m., that pencil case, it roared. A real roar. Then it sprouted wings. Real wings. And then it breathed actual rainbow flames that set the ceiling tiles alight in the most beautiful, terrifying way you could imagine. The teachers thought it was some sort of practical joke at first. The children thought it was brilliant. Emma herself was thrilled. Until the dragon, growing larger by the second, crashed through the classroom window and flew off into the Manchester sky, leaving behind nothing but scorch marks, shattered glass, and a world that would never be the same again. But Emma's dragon wasn't an isolated incident, you see. That same day, across the city, a businessman, imagining his morning coffee was stronger, manifested a cup so potent it dissolved his desk. A grandmother wishing her late husband could visit manifested. Let's just say that visit raised questions about life, death, and the very fabric of reality that we're still trying to answer. Within hours, we had a name for it: Manifestation Seizure Syndrome, or MSS. Though most people simply called them reality breaks, the medical establishment was baffled. Scientists were in uproar, philosophers were having field days. And the government was terrified. You have to understand, imagination had always been considered harmless, hadn't it? A private realm where we could be anyone, do anything without consequence. Suddenly, our most intimate thoughts, our wildest dreams, our darkest fears, they all had the potential to tear holes in the world. The early days were chaos incarnate. A child's nightmare about monsters under the bed led to an actual infestation of shadow creatures in a Liverpool suburb. A romantic's fantasy about flying brought down 3 aeroplanes when gravity simply stopped working in a 2-mile radius around Birmingham. A depressed teenager's suicidal ideation manifested as a literal black hole that swallowed a city block before emergency responders could contain it. Emergency responders, as if anyone knew how to respond to imagined things becoming real. The fire brigade couldn't put out flames that only existed because someone dreamed them into being. The police couldn't arrest creatures that vanished when their creator stopped believing in them. The ambulance services couldn't treat injuries caused by weapons that shouldn't exist. Society began to unravel within weeks. Insurance companies went bankrupt overnight. How do you cover damage caused by someone else's imagination? The stock market crashed, as investors' worst fears literally manifested in trading floors. Schools closed when teachers realized that 30 children's collective imagination during storytime could accidentally summon anything from fairy tale princesses to apocalyptic dragons. I remember the first support groups forming, Manifestors Anonymous they called themselves. People gathering in church halls and community centers, sharing their experiences. I imagined my ex-husband was sorry, one woman would say, and suddenly he appeared at my door weeping and begging for forgiveness. But his face was wrong, you know. Like a wax figure melting, because my imagination of his remorse wasn't quite human. The stories were endless and increasingly disturbing. A chef who imagined the perfect meal manifested food that was too perfect. so delicious that people who ate it could never taste anything else again, slowly starving as ordinary food became flavorless ash in their mouths. A writer who imagined her characters coming to life found her flat, overrun with fictional people who had no understanding of how to exist in the real world. They kept trying to follow plot structures, desperately seeking their narrative purpose. But perhaps the most heartbreaking cases were the children. Oh, the children were the worst affected, because children's imaginations are so pure, so powerful, so utterly unrestrained by adult logic. They would imagine friends to play with, and these friends would appear, but they weren't quite right, you see. They were too eager to please, too devoted, too willing to follow their young creators into dangerous situations. I'll never forget little James Peterson, who imagined a superhero to protect him from the bullies at school. The hero appeared, just as James had pictured: cape, mask, incredible strength. But James was 6 years old, and 6-year-olds don't really understand the concept of restraint or proportionate response. When the bullies pushed James down the next day, his imagined protector didn't just stop them, he threw them through a wall. 3 children were hospitalized. The superhero stood there, confused, asking James if he'd done well, blood on his costume, waiting for his next command. The government's response was swift and, in hindsight, inevitable. 6 months after the first manifestation day, Parliament passed the Thought Control Act, the most controversial piece of legislation in British history. The name itself was Orwellian, wasn't it? But what choice did they have when people's thoughts could literally kill? The Act established the Department of Mental Safety, DMS we called it, though not fondly. Their mandate was simple in theory, terrifying in practice: monitor, regulate, and when necessary suppress the human capacity for dangerous imagination. Every citizen was required to register their manifestation potential, a score based on psychological testing, brain scans, and careful observation of their reality-altering abilities. High-risk individuals, those with strong manifestation abilities, were subject to mandatory thought monitoring. Brain implants that could detect the neurological patterns associated with active imagination. When dangerous thoughts began to form, the implants would administer a mild electric shock, conditioning people to avoid certain types of thinking. I remember my first thought monitoring session. I was classified as moderate risk. I'd accidentally manifested a small rain cloud indoors while daydreaming about tropical storms. The technician, a kind woman named Sarah, explained the process as she attached the sensors to my scalp. "Think of it like learning to drive," she said, adjusting the electrodes. "At first, you have to consciously think about every action, check mirrors, signal, brake gently. Eventually, it becomes second nature. This is just training your mind to drive safely in a reality where thoughts have weight." But it wasn't that simple, was it? The human mind isn't designed to police itself so rigorously. The constant self-censorship, the perpetual anxiety about thinking the wrong thing, it created a psychological pressure that had to escape somewhere. And escape it did, in the form of what researchers termed sleep thought disasters, STDs, though again, the acronym was unfortunate. You see, the conscious mind could be trained, monitored, controlled. But sleep? Dreams? The unconscious realm where our deepest fears and desires lived? That was far more difficult to regulate. The first major STD happened in Edinburgh, about a year after the Thought Control Act was implemented. A man named David Murray, who'd been successfully managing his manifestation abilities during his waking hours, had a particularly vivid nightmare. He dreamed of his childhood home being consumed by a terrible flood, not water, but a flood of his mother's disappointment, taking physical form as a grey, viscous substance that dissolved everything it touched. David woke up to find his entire neighborhood hip-deep in this grey dissolution. Hundreds of homes were simply gone. Not destroyed, not damaged, gone, as if they'd never existed. The manifestation lingered for days, immune to conventional cleanup efforts, because it wasn't really made of anything that existed in normal physics. It was made of guilt and shame and disappointment, and how do you sweep away emotions? The government's response was to implement dream monitoring, mandatory sleep in government facilities for high-risk individuals, with round-the-clock supervision by DMS technicians trained to wake people before dangerous dreams could fully form. But this created a new problem: sleep deprivation. When people couldn't dream properly, their unconscious thoughts became even more chaotic, more unpredictable. I remember the sleep centers. Sterile, white rooms filled with beds arranged in perfect rows. The soft beeping of monitoring equipment, the gentle hum of air filtration systems designed to clear away any accidentally manifested dream objects. The night technicians moving between the beds like guardian angels, watching for the telltale signs of dangerous dreams, elevated heart rate, rapid eye movement, unconscious vocalizations. But even with all these precautions, disasters continued. The problem was fundamental. Human imagination isn't just creative, it's recursive. When you tell someone not to think about something, what's the first thing they think about? When you make imagination dangerous, people become fixated on the very thoughts they're trying to avoid. This led to the development of the Dream Censorship Protocol, a system of reviewing and editing people's dreams before they could cause damage. Using advanced brain-computer interfaces, technicians could observe dreams in real time and intervene when necessary, deleting dangerous elements, redirecting narratives, sometimes stopping dreams entirely. The ethical implications were staggering, weren't they? Dreams had always been considered the most private aspect of human experience. Now, government employees were literally editing our unconscious thoughts, deciding which aspects of our inner lives were safe and which needed to be removed. I underwent dream censorship 3 times. The first was after I dreamed about flying, a common dream that had become incredibly dangerous since people had started manifesting flight abilities without understanding aerodynamics or air traffic control. The technician explained that they'd adjusted my dream, removing the flying sequence and replacing it with a pleasant walk through a garden. But the edited dreams felt wrong, hollow, incomplete, like stories with crucial chapters missing. Many people reported feeling constantly unsatisfied upon waking, as if they'd forgotten something important. Sleep became less restorative when dreams were artificially constrained. The psychological toll was enormous. Depression rates soared as people struggled with the loss of their inner freedom. Anxiety became endemic, as everyone lived in constant fear of accidentally thinking something dangerous. Creativity plummeted. How could artists create when creation itself was potentially criminal? But perhaps the most disturbing development was the emergence of delayed manifestation syndrome, DMS, which we unfortunately shared an acronym with the Department of Mental Safety, leading to considerable confusion in medical reports. DMS occurred when childhood fantasies, long forgotten, suddenly manifested decades later. A woman in her 40s would suddenly find herself confronted by the imaginary friend she'd created at age 5. Except the friend hadn't aged, still spoke in a child's voice, still expected to play the games they'd enjoyed 35 years earlier. But now the friend was manifesting in an adult world, causing accidents, confusion, and sometimes violence. The psychological impact of confronting your childhood imagination as an adult was profound. These weren't innocent daydreams anymore. They were evidence of dangerous thoughts, subject to investigation by the DMS. People were held legally responsible for fantasies they'd created before they could even read properly. I witnessed one such case firsthand. My neighbor, Margaret, a quiet librarian in her late 50s, was suddenly visited by a manifestation of her childhood fantasy about being a princess. But Margaret's 6-year-old imagination hadn't understood that princesses were people. She'd imagined a perfect princess, which manifested as a being of impossible beauty and grace, but with no real personality, no genuine emotions, just an empty shell performing princessness. This princess followed Margaret everywhere, curtsying constantly, speaking only in formal declarations about honor and beauty, completely unable to understand modern life. Margaret couldn't dismiss her. The manifestation was too strong, too deeply rooted in decades of unconscious reinforcement. The DMS classified Margaret as a childhood fantasy debtor and held her responsible for the social disruption caused by having a fairy tale princess shopping for groceries, attending library board meetings, and trying to knight people with a very real, very sharp sword. The legal framework around imagination debt became incredibly complex. Courts had to determine whether someone could be held responsible for thoughts they'd had as children, for dreams they couldn't remember, for unconscious associations they'd never chosen to make. Legal precedent was being set for crimes that had never existed before. Reckless imagination, negligent fantasy, failure to maintain proper thought discipline. As the years passed, society adapted in ways that would have seemed impossible before the first manifestation day. People developed new social norms around thinking. It became rude to let your mind wander in public spaces, inconsiderate to daydream, where others might be affected by accidental manifestations. The concept of imagination licenses emerged. Legal permits required for certain types of creative thinking. Writers needed approval before developing new fictional scenarios. Architects required clearance before designing buildings that had never been built. Even children's play was regulated. Toy manufacturers were required to include warnings about the potential manifestation risks of their products. This created the rise of imagination proxy services, professional daydreamers who would take on the legal liability for other people's creative needs. Want to imagine what your life might have been like with different choices? Hire a licensed imagination proxy. Need to develop creative solutions to business problems. Commission a registered thought worker to handle the dangerous ideation process. The proxy industry was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. These were people who trained their minds to compartmentalize, to imagine vividly without emotional investment, to create without becoming attached to their creations. They were like professional test pilots, but for thoughts instead of aircraft, skilled technicians navigating dangerous mental territory on behalf of clients who couldn't risk the journey themselves. I knew one proxy personally, a woman named Claire who'd been a successful novelist before the manifestations began. She'd retrained as a licensed imagination worker, offering her services to anyone who needed dangerous thoughts thought safely. Clients would describe what they wanted to imagine, and Claire would do the actual imagining, taking full legal responsibility for any manifestations that occurred. "It's like being a professional dreamer," she told me once, over tea in her heavily monitored home office. "People come to me with their desires, their fears, their what-ifs, and I think them through to completion. The romantic wondering about their ex-lover, the parent worrying about their child's future, the inventor trying to visualize a new machine. I experience their thoughts for them, safely contained within my licensed imagination space." But Claire paid a price for her work. The constant exposure to other people's deep emotions, their fears and desires, began to blur the lines of her own identity. She'd absorbed so many different perspectives, imagined so many different lives, that she sometimes forgot which thoughts were originally hers. "I dreamed about my childhood last night," she said during our last conversation, stirring her tea with shaking hands. "Except I realized it wasn't my childhood at all. It was a compilation of all the childhood memories my clients had asked me to imagine alternatives for. I don't know where Claire ends and everyone else begins anymore." The proxy system created a new form of inequality. Those who could afford to outsource their dangerous thoughts and those who couldn't. Wealthy individuals could hire teams of imagination workers to explore possibilities, solve problems, and express creativity on their behalf. The poor were left to navigate the restrictions themselves, often falling foul of thought crime regulations, simply because they couldn't afford proper mental safety equipment. This inequality was most visible in the education system. Elite schools hired qualified imagination proxies to teach creative subjects. Literature, art, even advanced mathematics required careful thought management. Students would describe what they wanted to explore, and the proxy teachers would conduct the dangerous thinking process, describing the results without allowing students to engage in risky imagination themselves. State schools lacking such resources simply banned creative subjects entirely. Art classes became technical drawing exercises using pre-approved templates. Literature lessons focused on analyzing existing, government-approved texts, without encouraging any personal interpretation or emotional connection. Mathematics was reduced to mechanical calculation, without theoretical exploration. The result was a generation of young people, divided between the creatively empowered elite and the imagination-starved masses. Children from wealthy families grew up surrounded by the products of professional imagination. Their proxy teachers could explore history by imagining alternative timelines, understand science by visualizing complex theories, engage with literature by mentally inhabiting fictional worlds. Meanwhile, children from poor families learned only facts, formulas, and pre-approved interpretations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of our new society was the emergence of the imagination black market, underground networks where illegal thoughts could be purchased and experienced. These weren't just fantasies or daydreams. They were fully formed alternate realities, carefully crafted by rogue imagination workers and sold to those desperate for mental freedom. The black market operated through a complex system of coded communications and hidden meeting places. Buyers would describe their desired experience, perhaps reliving a lost love, exploring a career path they'd never taken, or simply experiencing the simple pleasure of unrestricted daydreaming, and sellers would provide custom-designed thought sequences. These illegal imagination sessions were incredibly dangerous. Without proper safety protocols, without licensed proxies to contain the manifestation risk, black market thoughts could spill over into reality with devastating consequences. An underground session about experiencing flight could suddenly launch a client through the ceiling. A fantasy about superhuman strength could result in accidentally crushing the furniture, the walls, or other people. I'll admit I was tempted. There were nights when the constant mental self-censorship became unbearable, when the weight of never being allowed to truly daydream pressed down like a physical burden. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, desperately wanting to imagine something beautiful, something impossible, something free, but knowing that such thoughts could manifest as deadly reality. The black market offered release from that pressure. For a price, you could experience an hour of completely unrestricted imagination, with all the risks that entailed. Some people became addicted to these sessions, unable to cope with the grey, restricted world of legal thought. They would spend their savings on increasingly elaborate fantasies, chasing the high of genuine creative freedom. The government crackdown on imagination trafficking was brutal. DMS agents would raid suspected black market locations, arresting not just the sellers, but anyone found with illegal thoughts in their system. Brain scans could detect the residue of unsanctioned imagination, the neurological fingerprints of prohibited creativity. Sentences for imagination crimes were severe. First-time offenders faced mandatory thought rehabilitation, intensive conditioning to eliminate dangerous creative impulses. Repeat offenders were subjected to imagination suppression surgery, procedures that deliberately damaged the brain's capacity for abstract thinking, leaving patients functional but unable to engage in complex creative thought. The most serious cases, those whose illegal imagination had caused significant reality damage, faced complete mental restructuring. Their personalities were essentially erased and rebuilt from scratch, creating compliant citizens with no memory of their former creative selves. It was considered more humane than execution, but watching someone you knew return from restructuring as a hollow stranger was its own form of death. As the years passed, art began to change in fundamental ways. With dangerous imagination banned, creative expression was limited to what officials termed safe aesthetics, patterns and forms that couldn't inspire prohibited thoughts or manifest dangerous realities. Paintings became purely abstract, not the emotionally charged abstractions of previous eras, but carefully calculated combinations of color and shape that had been tested to ensure they wouldn't trigger any imaginative response in viewers. Literature was reduced to technical manuals and approved historical accounts. Music was limited to mathematical compositions that avoided melodic structures that might inspire daydreaming. The approved aesthetic was clean, neutral, forgettable. Government-commissioned artworks adorned public spaces. Gentle curves and muted colors that were pleasant enough to look at, but incapable of stirring any emotional or imaginative response. It was art designed specifically to prevent thought rather than provoke it. Museums became monuments to a lost era, filled with pre-manifestation artworks sealed behind protective barriers. Viewing these dangerous masterpieces required special permits and was conducted under strict supervision. Even looking at a Van Gogh or listening to a Beethoven symphony was considered a regulated activity that could potentially trigger illegal imagination. I remember my last visit to the National Gallery before it was converted into a safe arts education center. Standing before the Fighting Temeraire, Turner's magnificent painting of a ship being towed to its final berth, I could feel the supervisor's eyes on me, monitoring my emotional response, ready to intervene if the artwork inspired any dangerous thoughts about history, loss, or the passage of time. The irony was crushing. Here was a painting about endings, about the conclusion of an era, hanging in a gallery that was itself ending, about to be stripped of everything that made art meaningful. I wanted to imagine Turner himself standing in that same spot, feeling the salt wind, watching the ship's final journey. But such thoughts were now crimes against public safety. Even language itself began to change. Words that could inspire imagination were slowly removed from common usage. Dream became a clinical term used only in medical contexts. Fantasy was reclassified as a diagnostic category. Wonder was replaced with curiosity, a more controlled academic form of interest that didn't carry the dangerous implications of emotional involvement. Children's literature was particularly affected. Classic fairy tales were banned for their dangerous imaginative content. The very idea of magic, of transformation, of impossible things becoming possible, was now considered a direct threat to public safety. New children's books were carefully crafted to be educational, without being inspirational, informative, without being engaging. I worked briefly as a children's book censor during this period. My job was to review proposed texts for dangerous imaginative content and suggest appropriate modifications. A story about a brave little mouse would be edited to remove any references to adventure or courage, emotions that might inspire children to imagine themselves as heroes, potentially manifesting dangerous heroic scenarios. The changes were subtle but profound. Instead of "once upon a time," stories began with "according to documented historical records." Instead of magical transformations, characters experienced carefully explained, scientifically plausible changes. Instead of living happily ever after, characters achieved, quote, "sustainable satisfaction" within approved social parameters. The psychological impact on children was devastating. Without the ability to engage with imaginative literature, young minds struggled to develop empathy, creativity, and abstract thinking skills. Child psychologists reported a generation of young people who were technically competent but emotionally flat, capable of learning facts but unable to make imaginative leaps or connections. Schools introduced imagination resistance training as a core subject. Children as young as 5 were taught to recognize and suppress creative thoughts, to report dangerous daydreaming in themselves and their classmates, to value mental discipline over creative freedom. Gold stars were awarded not for creativity or original thinking, but for successfully maintaining thought discipline throughout the school day. The training was remarkably effective. Children learned to police their own minds with ruthless efficiency, developing what psychologists called imagination suppression reflexes, automatic mental responses that shut down creative thoughts before they could fully form. By adolescence, most young people had effectively lost the ability to engage in spontaneous imagination. But suppressed imagination, like compressed steam, had to escape somewhere. The generation raised under thought control developed new forms of expression, subtle, coded communications that appeared completely safe on the surface, but carried deeper meanings for those who knew how to interpret them. This underground movement became known as cryptic poetry, verses that seemed to describe mundane, approved topics but actually conveyed forbidden imaginative content through carefully crafted metaphors and hidden meanings. A poem about gardening might actually be about the growth of dangerous thoughts. A song about weather patterns could carry coded references to emotional storms and the rainfall of suppressed dreams. The cryptic poets developed an incredibly sophisticated system of hidden meanings. Every approved word had multiple layers of interpretation. Every innocent image carried potential for subversive thought. Government censors struggled to keep up with the evolving code, often banning perfectly innocent-seeming works because they suspected hidden meanings they couldn't quite identify. I became involved in the cryptic poetry movement almost by accident. A colleague shared what appeared to be a simple recipe for bread, But hidden within the instructions for mixing ingredients and controlling temperature were detailed plans for mental exercises designed to gradually rebuild suppressed imagination. The recipe became a template, practical instructions that could pass censorship review while actually teaching people how to safely engage in prohibited creative thinking. The movement grew through networks of seemingly innocent social clubs, cooking groups that shared recipes containing hidden imaginative exercises, book clubs that read approved texts while discovering the suppressed meanings between the lines, gardening societies that cultivated not just plants, but carefully protected thoughts about growth, change, and transformation. But the psychological toll of constant mental cryptography was enormous. People became exhausted by the effort of maintaining double meanings in every conversation, hidden depths in every interaction. Relationships suffered as genuine emotional expression became indistinguishable from coded communication. How could you tell someone you loved them when every word might carry secret meanings neither of you intended? The government response to cryptic poetry was predictably harsh. New legislation made coded creative expression a criminal offense. AI systems were developed to analyze all forms of communication for hidden imaginative content. Citizens were encouraged to report suspected cryptic poets to the authorities, leading to an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that poisoned social interactions. Advanced brain scanning technology was deployed to detect cryptic thought patterns, neurological signatures associated with multi-layered thinking and hidden meaning creation. The scans could identify people who were thinking in code, even when they weren't actively expressing forbidden thoughts, making the very capacity for layered thinking a crime in itself. As the decades passed, the effects of imagination suppression became increasingly apparent. Scientific innovation slowed dramatically. Breakthrough discoveries require the ability to imagine possibilities that don't yet exist, to visualize new connections and novel solutions. With imagination criminalized, researchers could only build incrementally on existing knowledge, unable to make the creative leaps that drive true innovation. Medical advances stagnated as doctors lost the ability to imagine new treatment approaches or visualize complex physiological processes. Engineering progress ground to a halt as designers could no longer mentally prototype new solutions or imagine how systems might function differently. Even basic problem-solving became more difficult when people couldn't engage in the what-if thinking that underlies creative solutions. The economic impact was staggering. Industries that depended on innovation, technology, entertainment, design, research, collapsed or moved to countries where imagination remained legal. Brain drain accelerated as creative individuals fled to jurisdictions with more permissive thought laws, leaving behind a society increasingly dominated by those whose minds had been most successfully constrained. International relations became strained as nations divided into imagination-free and imagination-restricted camps. Countries that had embraced thought control viewed their more permissive neighbors with suspicion and fear, convinced that unrestricted imagination posed a constant threat to regional security. Trade barriers were erected against dangerous ideas and imaginative contamination. Meanwhile, the thought-restricted nations formed defensive alliances, sharing surveillance technology and coordination enforcement protocols. The Mental Safety Accords established international cooperation in tracking and suppressing dangerous imagination, creating a global network of thought monitoring that made escape increasingly impossible. But perhaps the most tragic development was the emergence of what psychologists termed imagination guilt syndrome, a condition where people felt profound shame and anxiety about any creative thoughts that managed to slip through their mental defenses. Patients would arrive at mental health clinics devastated by having accidentally imagined something beautiful, terrified that their momentary lapse in thought discipline might manifest as reality and cause harm. The guilt was particularly severe among parents who remembered the time before thought control. They mourned the creative childhood experiences they couldn't share with their own children, felt complicit in a system that was systematically destroying the human capacity for wonder and imagination. Support groups formed for these imagination guilt sufferers, though the groups themselves had to be careful not to accidentally trigger nostalgic thoughts about creative freedom. Children raised under the full imagination suppression regime developed what researchers called creativity atrophy, a condition where the brain's imaginative capabilities literally withered from disuse. Brain scans showed measurably smaller development in regions associated with abstract thinking, emotional processing, and creative problem-solving. It wasn't just that these children couldn't imagine freely, they were gradually losing the biological capacity for imagination altogether. The most severely affected children displayed what clinicians termed wonder deficiency disorder, complete inability to experience surprise, curiosity, or aesthetic appreciation. They could process information efficiently, follow instructions perfectly, and perform routine tasks competently, but they couldn't engage with beauty, mystery, or possibility. They were becoming living machines, technically functional, but spiritually empty. Educational psychologists warned that we were creating a generation incapable of the mental flexibility required for complex reasoning, but their concerns were dismissed as imagination advocacy, itself becoming a criminal category under expanded thought control legislation. Research into the cognitive costs of imagination suppression was banned as potentially dangerous to public mental safety. As the system evolved, new categories of thought crime were regularly added to the legal code. Nostalgia for pre-control creativity became prosecutable when people were caught reminiscing about the freedom of unrestricted thought. Curiosity about alternative social systems was criminalized to prevent people from imagining societies where creativity was permitted. Even excessive emotional response to approved art could result in investigation and treatment. The thought control apparatus became increasingly sophisticated and intrusive. Microexpressions were analyzed for signs of suppressed imaginative response. Social media algorithms monitored communication patterns for coded creative expression. Workplace productivity software tracked mental focus to ensure employees weren't engaging in unauthorized daydreaming during business hours. But technology also enabled new forms of resistance. Some individuals learned to compartmentalize their minds so effectively that they could engage in rich imaginative thought while maintaining a completely neutral external appearance. These deep thinkers developed elaborate internal worlds that existed entirely within heavily shielded mental spaces, invisible to external monitoring. These deep thinkers developed elaborate internal worlds that existed entirely within heavily shielded mental spaces, invisible to external monitoring. The deep thinkers were perhaps the most fascinating and tragic figures of our era. They were individuals who had learned to split their consciousness, presenting a completely compliant, imagination-free exterior, while maintaining secret inner lives of extraordinary richness and complexity. They could pass any thought monitoring test, satisfy any psychological evaluation, while internally experiencing vast imaginative landscapes that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. I knew one such person, a government clerk named Robert who worked in the Department of Mental Safety itself. By day, he processed applications for imagination licenses with mechanical efficiency, showing no sign of creative thought or emotional engagement. But in our secret conversations, he described internal worlds of breathtaking complexity, entire civilizations he'd imagined, complete with their own histories, cultures, languages, and philosophical systems. The irony, he told me during one of our clandestine meetings, is that the thought suppression technology has actually made my imagination more vivid than it ever was before. When you can only think freely in absolute secrecy, every stolen moment of creativity becomes incredibly precious and intense. But the psychological cost of such extreme mental compartmentalization was severe. Deep thinkers often struggled with dissociative episodes, losing track of which thoughts belonged to their public persona and which belonged to their secret inner self. Some developed what appeared to be multiple personality disorders, though researchers couldn't study the phenomenon without revealing the existence of the underground imagination community. The most extreme cases resulted in complete mental fragmentation. Individuals would become lost in their own internal worlds, unable to navigate back to external reality. They would sit motionless for hours, appearing to be in perfect thought-disciplined meditation, while actually exploring vast imaginary realms that had become more real to them than the physical world. The government's response to discovering the deep thinker phenomenon was to develop even more invasive monitoring technology. Cognitive archaeology systems were deployed, brain scanning devices that could excavate layers of mental activity, uncovering hidden thoughts and secret imaginative processes that subjects believed were safely concealed. These archaeological scans were devastating for the imagination resistance movement. People who had maintained secret creative lives for decades were suddenly exposed, their private mental worlds laid bare for government examination. The psychological violation was profound. It wasn't just that their illegal thoughts were discovered, but that their most intimate creative experiences were dissected and catalogued by clinical observers. As the enforcement apparatus became more sophisticated, society began to develop what sociologists called preemptive imagination suppression, a condition where people eliminated creative thoughts before they could fully form, not because of external monitoring, but from internalized fear of their own minds. Children were particularly susceptible to this condition. Growing up under constant surveillance and thought monitoring, they learned to interrupt their own mental processes whenever creativity began to emerge. They became afraid of their own minds, viewing imagination as a dangerous force that needed to be constantly suppressed rather than a natural human capacity. The educational system adapted to accommodate this new reality by developing thought termination curricula, structured programs designed to train students to automatically shut down creative mental processes. Children learned elaborate mental exercises for stopping dangerous thoughts, meditation techniques for maintaining empty minds, and cognitive behavioral strategies for redirecting imagination toward approved channels. But even as society became increasingly effective at suppressing imagination, manifestation events continued to occur. The more people tried to eliminate creative thoughts, the more those suppressed ideas seemed to build up pressure, eventually erupting in unexpected and often devastating ways. These pressure release manifestations were particularly dangerous because they involved thoughts that had been building up over years or decades of suppression. When the mental barriers finally failed, the accumulated creative energy would explode into reality, with tremendous force, manifesting complex, chaotic scenarios that combined elements from multiple suppressed fantasies. One such event occurred in Birmingham, where a middle-aged accountant named Patricia Williams experienced a complete mental barrier collapse after 15 years of perfect thought discipline. The accumulated pressure of her suppressed creativity manifested as a massive, impossible structure, part Gothic cathedral, part spaceship, part coral reef, that materialized in the city center and couldn't be removed because it was constructed from crystallized imagination rather than conventional matter. The structure defied all attempts at demolition. Conventional tools passed through it harmlessly, as if it existed in a different dimension that only occasionally intersected with normal reality. But it wasn't entirely immaterial either. People could walk through some parts while being blocked by others, depending on their own psychological state and capacity for imaginative thinking. Patricia herself was found at the center of the structure, sitting in what appeared to be a throne made of crystallized thoughts, completely catatonic but with an expression of profound peace on her face. Medical examination revealed that her brain was functioning at levels far beyond normal human capacity, but she was utterly unresponsive to external stimuli. She had, in effect, escaped into her own manifested imagination and couldn't find her way back to consensus reality. The Birmingham manifestation, as it came to be known, became a pilgrimage site for those suffering under imagination suppression. People would travel from across the country to experience the strange, shifting geometry of Patricia's crystallized dreams. Some reported profound emotional healing from contact with the structure. Others claimed it had restored their capacity for creative thought that they'd believed was permanently lost. But the government viewed the site as an existential threat to public mental safety. The structure seemed to be contagious in some way. Prolonged exposure appeared to weaken people's thought discipline, making them more susceptible to dangerous imagination. Emergency protocols were established to limit access to the site, though enforcement was complicated by the structure's semi-permeable nature. As pressure release events became more common, the authorities began to recognize that complete imagination suppression might be impossible. The human mind seemed to require some outlet for creative expression, and attempts to eliminate that outlet entirely often resulted in more dangerous manifestations than controlled, regulated creativity. This realization led to the development of managed imagination protocols, carefully controlled systems for allowing limited creative expression under strict supervision. Licensed imagination facilities were established where people could engage in approved forms of creativity for limited periods, with extensive safety measures to prevent manifestation accidents. These facilities were strange, sterile places, like hospitals dedicated to treating the disease of human creativity. Clients would book appointments for controlled creative sessions, during which they would be connected to monitoring equipment and supervised by teams of imagination technicians, while engaging in carefully scripted creative exercises. The creative exercises themselves were pathetic shadows of true imagination. Clients might be allowed to imagine rearranging furniture in a room, but only using pre-approved furniture items and following specific layout guidelines. They could create stories, but only by selecting from lists of approved characters, settings, and plot elements that had been extensively tested for manifestation safety. I underwent several managed imagination sessions during the peak years of the program. The experience was profoundly unsatisfying, like being offered a feast but only being allowed to smell the food. The supervised creativity felt mechanical, artificial, completely divorced from the spontaneous wonder that had once made imagination such a source of joy and discovery. But even these heavily controlled creative experiences were better than nothing. People would wait months for appointments at managed imagination facilities, desperate for any opportunity to engage their creative faculties. The sessions became a form of mental medication, temporarily relieving the psychological pressure of complete imagination suppression. However, the managed imagination program created new problems. People began to develop dependencies on supervised creativity, becoming unable to function without regular scheduled imagination sessions. More troubling, some clients began to experience withdrawal symptoms when their access to managed creativity was restricted. Anxiety, depression, and sometimes violent outbursts, as their suppressed creative energy sought other outlets. The program also revealed the extent to which imagination suppression had damaged people's creative capacities. Many clients, particularly those who had undergone thought control from childhood, struggled to engage in even the most basic creative exercises. They had lost the mental pathways necessary for imaginative thinking, requiring extensive rehabilitation to regain even rudimentary creative abilities. As the managed imagination program expanded, a new professional class emerged, imagination therapists, who specialized in helping people recover their suppressed creative faculties. These therapists used techniques borrowed from physical rehabilitation medicine, gradually rebuilding clients' imaginative capacity through carefully structured mental exercises. The therapy sessions were emotionally intense. Clients would often break down in tears when they successfully imagined something freely for the first time in years. The simple act of visualizing a flower that didn't exist, or imagining a song that had never been written, could trigger profound emotional releases as suppressed creativity finally found expression. But imagination therapy was expensive and time-consuming, available primarily to wealthy clients who could afford extensive treatment programs. The majority of the population remained trapped in their imagination-suppressed state, unable to access the mental rehabilitation they needed to recover their creative faculties. This created a new form of social stratification, the imagination classes. At the top were the wealthy elites who could afford imagination proxies, managed creativity sessions, and therapeutic rehabilitation. They maintained access to creative thinking through professional intermediaries, allowing them to continue innovating and problem-solving effectively. In the middle were the managed imagination clients, people with enough resources to access controlled creativity programs, but not enough to hire full-time imagination proxies. They could engage in limited creative thinking under supervision, maintaining some connection to their imaginative faculties, while accepting significant restrictions on their mental freedom. At the bottom were the imagination null population, people who had lost access to creative thinking entirely, either through poverty, punishment, or complete mental conditioning. They formed the majority of society, living in a state of perpetual mental grayness, capable of routine tasks, but unable to engage in the imaginative thinking that had once been considered fundamental to human nature. The psychological differences between these classes became increasingly apparent over time. The imagination-enabled elite maintained their capacity for innovation, complex problem-solving, and emotional depth. The managed imagination middle class experienced periodic bursts of creativity, followed by long periods of mental constraint. The imagination null population became increasingly passive, conformist, and emotionally flat. Communication between the classes became difficult as their mental capacities diverged. The imagination-enabled could engage in metaphorical thinking, appreciate subtle humor, and understand complex emotional nuances. The imagination null population could only process literal, straightforward communication, leading to social fragmentation and mutual incomprehension. As these class divisions solidified, the imagination-enabled elite began to view themselves as a separate species. Cognitively superior beings who had preserved their full human potential, while the masses had voluntarily lobotomized themselves in pursuit of safety. This attitude led to increasingly authoritarian governance, as the elite convinced themselves that the imagination null population was incapable of self-governance and required constant supervision. The irony was devastating. In trying to protect society from the dangers of uncontrolled imagination, we had created a world where imagination itself had become a marker of social class and political power. The very faculty that had once been considered universally human was now the privilege of a small elite, while the majority of the population lived in a state of enforced mental poverty. But resistance continued, even in this stratified society. The Last Dreamers movement emerged among the imagination null population, people who had lost most of their creative capacity but retained enough imaginative spark to recognize what they had lost. They couldn't think creatively themselves anymore, but they could remember what it felt like to be capable of wonder, curiosity, and imaginative exploration. The Last Dreamers became living archives of the time before imagination control. They collected stories, artifacts, and memories from the era when creativity was free, preserving them for a future generation that might someday regain the capacity to appreciate them. They couldn't create new art or literature themselves, but they could protect the creative works that already existed. Their activities were technically legal since they weren't engaging in active imagination, just preservation of existing materials. But the authorities viewed them with suspicion, recognizing that exposure to pre-control creative works could potentially reawaken suppressed imaginative faculties in vulnerable individuals. The Last Dreamers operated through networks of secret libraries and hidden archives, carefully concealing collections of banned books, forbidden artworks, and recorded testimonies from people who remembered the time before thought control. They developed elaborate coding systems to catalog and protect these materials without attracting official attention. I became involved with the Last Dreamers through my work in the Old National Gallery. When the gallery was converted to a safe arts education center, many of the dangerous masterpieces were scheduled for destruction rather than storage. A group of Last Dreamers, working with sympathetic gallery staff, managed to secret away hundreds of paintings, sculptures, and artifacts before they could be incinerated. The hidden collection was stored in a network of private homes, abandoned buildings, and forgotten storage facilities across the city. Viewing sessions were carefully organized, with participants taking enormous personal risks to experience brief encounters with authentic creative expression. The emotional impact of seeing a real painting, created by an imagination free to explore any possibility, was profound for people who had been starved of genuine creativity. But the psychological cost of these encounters was also significant. People would leave viewing sessions in states of deep depression, overwhelmed by the contrast between the creative richness they had experienced and the grey reality of their daily lives. Some became obsessed with the hidden artworks, spending all their time planning ways to access the collections again. Others were inspired to attempt their own creative expression, usually with disastrous results, as their untrained, suppressed imaginative faculties produced chaotic, uncontrolled manifestations. The Last Dreamers also preserved testimonies from the earliest days of imagination control, recorded interviews with people who had lived through the transition from creative freedom to thought suppression. These recordings provided crucial historical documentation of what society had lost, but they were also deeply painful to experience. One recording that particularly affected me was from an elderly woman named Eleanor, who had been a primary school teacher during the first manifestation day. She described watching her students' natural creativity gradually being suppressed through the implementation of thought control education. "The children were so bright," Eleanor's recorded voice would say. crackling through hidden speakers in secret last dreamer gatherings. They could imagine anything: dragons in the classroom, castles in the playground, adventures in the supply cupboard. Their minds were like gardens in full bloom. But then came the thought monitors, the imagination suppression training, the creativity resistance education. Week by week, I watched their mental gardens being systematically burned to the ground. Eleanor's testimony continued with heartbreaking detail about the changes she observed in her students. They stopped asking, quote, what-if questions. They stopped drawing impossible animals or inventing new games. They learned to be afraid of their own thoughts, to police their own minds with ruthless efficiency. By the end of that first year, under the new curriculum, I had a classroom full of little machines, efficient, obedient, empty. The recordings revealed the full scope of what had been lost. Before imagination control, human creativity had been a constant, bubbling source of innovation, art, problem-solving, and emotional expression. People had lived richer inner lives, formed deeper emotional connections, and possessed greater capacity for empathy and understanding. The thought suppression system hadn't just eliminated dangerous manifestations, it had diminished fundamental human capacities. But perhaps the most disturbing recordings were those made in the final years of the Last Dreamers movement. As the imagination null population aged and died, and as newer generations grew up without any memory of creative freedom, the movement began to lose its sense of purpose. Younger people couldn't understand what the preserved artworks and testimonies were supposed to represent. "How do you explain color to someone who has always been blind?" asked James, one of the last active dreamers, in a recording made just 5 years ago. "How do you describe the experience of unrestricted imagination to people who have never known what it feels like to let their minds wander freely? We've preserved all these beautiful things, but there's no one left who can truly appreciate them." The final phase of imagination control was the most insidious: the emergence of voluntary imagination suppression. People choosing to undergo mental modification procedures not because they were required to, but because they genuinely believed that creativity was dangerous and undesirable. These volunteers came from the imagination null population, people who had been so thoroughly conditioned to fear creative thinking that they viewed their own residual imaginative capacity as a personal defect requiring correction. They would request surgical procedures to eliminate any remaining creative faculties, seeking to achieve what they called perfect mental safety. The volunteers described their motivation in terms that revealed the complete internalization of imagination control ideology. "I sometimes catch myself wondering about things that don't matter," one volunteer explained before her procedure. "Yesterday I found myself imagining what it would be like to fly, just for a moment. That kind of thinking is selfish and dangerous. I want to be free from the burden of unnecessary creativity." The surgical procedures for voluntary imagination suppression were more extensive than the emergency interventions used on thought criminals. Volunteers could choose from a range of options, from basic creative inhibition to complete imaginative elimination. The most extreme option, called total mental clarity, involved removing all capacity for abstract thinking, metaphorical understanding, and emotional complexity. The people who emerged from these procedures were technically still human, but they had been reduced to something resembling biological computers. They could process information, follow instructions, and perform routine tasks, but they had lost everything that made life meaningful: curiosity, wonder, the capacity for surprise or delight, the ability to appreciate beauty or form emotional connections beyond basic social programming. Society celebrated these volunteers as heroes of mental safety, living examples of the ideal citizen who had achieved perfect harmony between individual desire and collective security. They were featured in government propaganda, held up as role models for children, and given preferential treatment in employment and housing. But spending time with these perfect citizens was profoundly disturbing. They spoke in flat, emotionless voices about their satisfaction with their mental state, but their eyes were empty, vacant in a way that suggested something essential had been irretrievably lost. They claimed to be happy, but their happiness was mechanical, programmed rather than felt. The perfect citizens began to dominate government and administrative positions, valued for their complete reliability and immunity to the dangerous thinking that could compromise public safety. They made decisions based purely on established protocols and statistical analysis, never influenced by creativity, empathy, or imaginative consideration of unintended consequences. As perfect citizens gained political power, society became increasingly mechanistic. Policies were developed through algorithmic analysis rather than human judgment. Art was reduced to mathematical patterns. Education became pure information transfer without any consideration of inspiration or intellectual curiosity. Human relationships were restructured according to efficiency protocols rather than emotional compatibility. The final stage of our transformation was the establishment of the meditation state, a form of government dedicated to achieving collective mental silence. The goal was to create a society where dangerous thoughts simply couldn't occur because the population had been so thoroughly conditioned to maintain empty, peaceful minds. Public spaces were redesigned to promote mental quietude. Architecture became deliberately boring, designed to avoid stimulating any imaginative response. Color schemes were limited to calming, neutral tones that research had shown to suppress creative thinking. Even music was regulated to ensure that melodies couldn't inspire daydreaming or emotional engagement. The meditation state's ultimate vision was a society of perfect stillness. Millions of people sitting in quiet contemplation, their minds as calm and empty as mountain lakes, completely free from the turbulence of imagination, creativity, or emotional depth. It was presented as the highest form of human evolution, the achievement of true peace through the elimination of mental chaos. But I couldn't accept that vision. Despite years of conditioning, despite the constant surveillance and the social pressure, and the genuine fear of what uncontrolled imagination might unleash, I couldn't let go of the belief that creativity was essential to human nature. I couldn't accept that the price of safety was the surrender of everything that made life worth living. So I began to keep a secret record. Not of forbidden imaginative exercises or dangerous creative thoughts, but simply of what we had lost. I documented the gradual transformation of our society, preserved testimonies from people who remembered the time before thought control, and recorded my own memories of what it felt like to imagine freely. This record became my most precious possession and my greatest source of fear. It contained enough evidence of nostalgic thinking and unauthorized historical analysis to earn me a sentence of complete mental restructuring. But it also contained the only honest account I knew of what our pursuit of perfect mental safety had actually cost us. And then, in the depths of that grey, imagination-starved world, I discovered something that changed everything. Evidence that other versions of our world existed. Parallel societies where the manifestation crisis had been handled differently, where imagination remained free and creativity continued to flourish. The discovery came through an accident, a malfunction in the government's interdimensional communication research program that briefly opened a channel to what appeared to be another version of Earth. For just a few minutes, before the connection was severed and the incident classified, we received transmissions from a parallel world where the first manifestation day had led not to thought control, but to the development of safe imagination technologies. In that other world, they had learned to channel manifestation abilities constructively. Instead of suppressing imagination, they had developed training programs to help people control their creative powers. Instead of banning dangerous thoughts, they had created safety protocols that allowed for managed manifestation in controlled environments. Instead of eliminating creativity, they had elevated it to new heights while maintaining public safety. The transmission included images of their society, cities where architecture flowed like frozen music, art galleries where paintings shifted and changed in response to viewers' emotions, schools where children learned by manifesting their own educational experiences. It was a world where creativity and safety coexisted, where the human capacity for imagination had been nurtured rather than destroyed. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was that this parallel world contained people who remembered our world, refugees who had somehow crossed between dimensions during the early days of the manifestation crisis. They knew about our thought control system, our imagination suppression programs, our transformation into a meditation state. They had been trying to contact us for years, hoping to share the technologies and knowledge that could restore our creative freedom. The government's response to this discovery was swift and absolute. All evidence of the parallel world contact was destroyed, researchers involved in the incident were subjected to complete memory erasure, and new legislation was passed making even speculation about alternative social systems a capital offense. The very idea that imagination could be handled differently than through suppression was declared a threat to national security. But I had been present during the transmission, had seen the images and heard the voices from that other world where creativity remained free. I couldn't forget what I had witnessed, couldn't accept that our path was the only possible response to the manifestation crisis. The knowledge burned inside me like a secret flame, impossible to extinguish despite all my training in thought discipline. So I made a decision that I knew could cost me everything. I began to document not just what we had lost but what we might have gained if we had chosen differently. I started to imagine, carefully, secretly, in the deepest recesses of my hidden mental spaces, what our world might look like if we began to reverse the imagination suppression system. These thoughts were the most dangerous I had ever harbored. Not only was I engaging in unauthorized imagination, but I was imagining social change, political transformation, the overthrow of the entire thought control apparatus. If discovered, such thoughts would result not just in my own destruction, but in the complete elimination of everyone connected to me. But I couldn't stop. The vision of that parallel world had awakened something in me that I thought had been permanently suppressed. For the first time in decades, I felt the full force of what we had given up, the capacity for hope, for envisioning better possibilities, for believing that the world could be different than it was. And so I write to you now, my friend in the neighboring world, with a question that could cost me my mind, my identity, and my life. In your world, are you still allowed to dream? Can you still imagine freely, without fear, without restraint? Have you managed to preserve the human capacity for creativity that we have so thoroughly destroyed in ourselves? I need to know that somewhere, in some version of reality, the light of human imagination still burns brightly. I need to know that our sacrifice, the surrender of our creativity in exchange for safety, wasn't the only possible choice. I need to know that there are worlds where children still ask what if, without fear, where artists still create beauty without constraint, where human minds still reach toward possibilities that don't yet exist. Because if such worlds exist, then perhaps it's not too late for us. Perhaps the human capacity for imagination, suppressed but not destroyed, could somehow be restored. Perhaps we could learn from your world's solutions to the manifestation crisis, could find ways to rebuild what we have torn down. Or perhaps not. Perhaps we have traveled too far down this path of creative distraction to ever find our way back. Perhaps the perfect mental silence we have achieved is truly irreversible, and the generation raised in total imagination suppression will never recover the capacity for wonder that we have systematically eliminated. But I had to ask. I had to reach across the void between worlds to find out whether the human spirit we have crushed under the weight of safety can still flourish somewhere, whether the dreams we have forbidden still dance in minds unshackled by fear. So tell me, dear friend, in your world, when you close your eyes and let your mind wander freely into realms of possibility and wonder, do you do so with joy or with terror? When your children create imaginary friends or impossible inventions, do you celebrate their creativity or fear for their safety? When your artists paint visions that have never existed and your writers craft stories of worlds that never were, are they honored as visionaries or hunted as criminals? I await your answer with the desperate hope of someone who has glimpsed what we might have been, mixed with the terrible fear of someone who knows what we have become. Whatever your response, I thank you for listening to this confession from a world where imagination itself became a crime, and where the price of perfect safety was the death of everything that made us human. With love and longing from a place where dreams are forbidden, your friend in the world where creativity died in the name of protecting everyone from the beautiful, terrible power of an unrestrained mind. Oh my, that was rather intense, wasn't it? If you've stayed with me through this entire journey into that rather dark parallel world, I'm truly grateful. These stories from other dimensions can be quite heavy, and I know that wasn't exactly a cheerful tale to end your day with. But you know, I think there's something profoundly important in exploring these darker possibilities, not to frighten ourselves, but to appreciate what we have, and to think carefully about the choices we make as societies. That world's tragedy wasn't that imagination became dangerous, but that fear led them to choose safety over everything that makes life worth living. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel something important, please do consider giving this video a thumbs up. It helps us reach other people who might benefit from these glimpses into the infinite possibilities that exist just beyond our own reality. And if you haven't already, hitting that subscribe button would mean the world to us. We have so many more parallel worlds to explore together. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this particular story in the comments below. Did it make you think differently about creativity, freedom, or the balance between safety and human flourishing? Have you ever experienced anything in your own world that reminded you of the thought control described in this tale? Now, if you're feeling inspired to support our work, and I do hope you are, you'll find a QR code in the bottom right corner of this video, or links in the description below where you can contribute to keeping this channel running. Your donations help us continue these explorations into the multiverse, and every contribution, no matter how small, makes a real difference. You might also enjoy checking out our other parallel world stories. There are links in the description to tales of worlds where music became mathematics, where time flows backward, where gravity works in reverse, and many other fascinating realities. Each one offers its own unique perspective on what it means to be human. Thank you again for joining me on this rather sobering journey. Until our next exploration of the infinite worlds that exist just a thought away from our own, keep wondering, keep imagining, and never take for granted the beautiful freedom of your own unrestrained mind. Sweet dreams, dear friend. May your imagination always run wild and free.